Okay, everyone, we're going to begin this last panel. Thanks so much for sticking with us until the end. I'm Kelsey Norman. I'm a fellow for the Middle East, and I'm director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program here at the Baker Institute. So this last panel is focusing on migration and displacement in the region. And I began studying this issue in 2011, which would turn out to be a watershed moment in terms of migration when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa. One undeniable consequence of the 2011 Arab uprisings that we've talked about numerous times today has been this displacement of individuals and families, both within the Middle East, but also further afield. In some cases, uprisings turned into civil war. We can think of Syrians, Libyans, or Yemenis who were forced to look for safety, sometimes outside of their respective countries, sometimes internally. Other events, such as the post-2011 repression of activists in Egypt, which we also talked about today, or faltering economies in Tunisia and Lebanon, as well as most recently, the reinstallment of a Taliban-led regime in Afghanistan, have all forced individuals across international borders. And while most refugees do remain within the region, and that's an important point that we'll talk about today, I'm sure, others have had to look for safety further afield. We can think about the 2015 political crisis in Europe that was effectively the result of arriving refugees, mostly Syrians, but also other nationalities, which had these far-reaching repercussions, including the rise of right-wing parties across Europe, and as Ambassador Djerejian likes to point out in various conversations, really provided the ground for Brexit and the repercussions of that. So political fears around migration have spread as well to North America. We can think back around that same time period and former President Trump with his installment of the quote-unquote Muslim ban. And that was a direct response to the arrival of Syrians in Europe. So all of that to say, the political stakes of this issue are very high, both within the region, which is host to the largest numbers of displaced peoples in the world, but also around the globe. So we've assembled a panel of experts to discuss several key issues related to this topic. First, how has the past decade's displacement impacted societies, domestic politics, economies, and international relations of the Middle East, but also with other regions, including Europe, as well as the US? Second, how has Middle East displacement since the Arab uprisings restructured and transformed the very nature of the global refugee regime, altering power asymmetries and diplomatic dynamics? Third, how have previous iterations of displacement pre-2011, including the historical displacement of Palestinians, which we didn't really talk about on the Arab-Israeli panel earlier today, but there's millions of Palestinians still living in exile effectively in other Arab states. That's very much impacted the way that countries have responded to later displacement, such as Iraqis or Syrians. And finally, how will new challenges and pressures, including climate change, impact displacement within and from the region in the years and decades to come, and how should policies address this going forward? So I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. You'll find their full bios in the program. And each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. We're a little short on time for this panel, so we'll see whatever length of discussion we're able to have after that. So first we'll hear from Kathleen Newland, Senior Fellow and Co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Then we'll hear from Edine Salihian, Professor of Political Science at the University of North Texas and Executive Director of the Peace Science Society. Then we'll hear from Marissa Kherma, Program Director of the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center. And lastly, we'll hear from Elizabeth Ferris, research professor at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. So Kathleen, if you'd like to lead us off.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and I'm delighted to be here. Very grateful for the invitation on this very important occasion. We're looking forward after a decade of displacement in the Middle East, but as we've heard today, it's actually much more than a decade, 7 decades at least. And I want to start with some figures, both to make sure we're on the same page and also to emphasize how dynamic the situation is today. At the end of last year, the consensus figure on global forced displacement, that is, all manner of refugees and people forcibly displaced within their own countries, was about 84 million people forcibly displaced around the world. Now we are approaching and maybe have surpassed 100 million. This is a milestone that we never should have reached, and it's happened very quickly with Ukraine, with displacement in Ethiopia, from Venezuela, from Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, additional displacements in Syria and Yemen. The majority of these 100 million are displaced within their own countries, and Beth is going to talk more about that. About almost 6 million of them are Palestinian refugees in the Middle East under the mandate of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. And I can talk more about that particular and rather peculiar status in our discussion if we have time. There are close to 5 million asylum seekers, over 4 million Venezuelans who've been displaced abroad. And most of the rest are more sort of conventionally defined refugees who are under the mandate of the UN Refugee Agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. 6.8 million of the refugees are from Syria, about 4 million from Afghanistan, a third of a million from Iraq, and of course a great many more people internally displaced in the region. Around the world, 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries, and 73% live in neighboring countries. So refugees go quickly to the place they can get to and find a modicum of safety. I'm using rough figures here because I don't want to leave you with the misleading impression that we have exact and very precise figures for refugees, because they are very dynamic, and people who are displaced and on the move are hard to count. But we do know that global figures on displacement have been going up, and the international community has recognized that. And it's recognized that the traditional responses were not adequate or sustainable. And so UNHCR in about 2016 launched a new approach, recognizing that the system was breaking down. And the international community rarely reached a consensus that this new approach was needed and accepted it, codified as something called the Global Compact on Refugees, which was affirmed by 164 countries in the UN General Assembly in 2018, opposed only by the United States and Hungary. And the US, I'm happy to say, has since affirmed its support for the compact. It's no accident that the negotiations for the compact started in 2016, as Europe saw the largest refugee flows since World War II. In 2015 and 16, over 1.3 million refugees entered Europe, most of them from Syria. Now, Turkey, remember, has received well over 3 million refugees from Syria in that period, and a few years earlier, without sparking a systemic change. But it took the direct impact on Europe, on major donor countries, to kickstart this effort. The compact has 4 main objectives. It's meant to ease pressure on host countries, and that's taken shape in things like the World Bank for the first time opening refugee facilities. Its support for refugee situations has gone from about 2 in 2017 to about 19 today. And all the international development banks together have so far committed about $2.5 billion to refugee assistance. A second objective of the compact is to enhance the self-reliance of refugees, which of course is very closely related to the first objective. So legally, by now, 3/4 of registered refugees can legally work in their host countries. Now, this doesn't always work out in practice. There are often a lot of bureaucratic hurdles to jump through and some recalcitrance on the part of especially local authorities. But still, the legal right to work is something that's extremely important. A third objective is to expand access to what are called third country solutions, to give refugees an opportunity to go somewhere other than their home country or the country of first asylum. And that has meant not just expanding conventional refugee resettlement, but also trying to open labor markets, educational pathways, and so on, to refugees who have often been excluded from getting regular work visas, for example, or education visas. And one of the most interesting and I think promising aspects of expanding third country solutions has been initiatives around private sponsorship of refugees, following the Canadian model where private citizens can volunteer to sponsor a refugee financially and socially and help them get settled, and can even, in the case of Canada, name the refugee that they want to sponsor. So if they have relatives who are refugees, or friends, or just someone that they know or have heard of, they can sponsor them for admission. States have so far made 1,600 individual pledges to implement the compact, which is a lot, and some of them really are producing results. The donor countries have a strong stability, a strong interest in stability in the host countries, and we've certainly had much experience of the instability caused by long-lasting refugee situations. And donors also have an overweening interest in keeping the refugee problem over there, helping host countries, making refugees more self-sufficient, and so on. So we have a strong self-interest in promoting the compact. Since this conference is also focusing on challenges for U.S. policy, I want to pivot briefly to U.S. policy looking forward. The U.S. has long been the strongest supporter of the international refugee regime, financially and usually politically, though always its own geopolitical interests and views are central to that. That was especially true during the Cold War, but it certainly hasn't changed materially. This strong support fell apart during the Trump administration. The refugee resettlement program plummeted from 85,000 in 2016 to 12,000 in 2020. It's been very hard to rebuild because of that drop. The resettlement infrastructure within the United States was decimated or worse. And on top of that, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which closed consulates in refugee hosting countries, cut off the travel of U.S. ICE officers who interviewed refugees for resettlement and so on. It's been extremely hard to rebuild. So even though the Biden administration has committed to raising the ceiling, and in fact it was raised to 65,000 in fiscal year 21, but it was only possible to bring in 12,000 refugees because of this combination of infrastructure and the pandemic. The Middle East was particularly badly affected, not least because of the 2017 travel ban list, as Kelsey mentioned, which was heavily focused on Muslim countries. And the resettlement process itself is very complex. There have been some innovations to speed it up, like being able to do virtual rather than in-person interviews, but there remains a lot of rebuilding to do. As you know, foreign policy issues are deeply interwoven, and I think I want to say just a word about the implications of the war in Ukraine for the Middle East and Syria in particular. There is, of course, competition for resources, for political bandwidth, for policy attention, and for admissions numbers. But there are some other implications as well. Turkey, for one, has learned to play the refugee card and to sort of threaten European countries with, and in fact has not been cooperating well with European countries in containing refugee flows for the last couple of years. As you may know, Russia has helped, through votes in the UN, to shut down 3 humanitarian corridors for relief supplies into Syria. Now it's threatening to vote in the UN to shut down the last remaining corridor, the Bab al-Hawa crossing into Idlib province, where 1 million civilians depend on it. The Bab al-Hawa crossing is expected to be used as a bargaining chip in relation to Ukraine, putting pressure particularly on Turkey to soft pedal sanctions, because Turkey could be expected to receive many thousands more refugees from Idlib if that corridor is closed. So this is a rather more direct connection between Ukraine and Syria than the more common concerns about competition for resources. So looking forward from a decade of displacement in the Middle East, I'm afraid we can expect more decades of displacement. The trifecta of the continuing pandemic, food insecurity, greatly exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, and climate change will increase displacement, but not, for the most part, in the context of refugee protection. There will be humanitarian aid in response to these challenges, but not the protections owed to refugees under international law. So a new path will have to be found to respond to these new forms and orders of magnitude of displacement. And I'm sure that my fellow panelists will take you much more deeply into some of these issues.
Thank you, Kathleen. Aidin?
All right, thank you for having me here today. My focus will be on the geopolitics of displacement in the Middle East and the implications of refugee flows and displacement in terms of international peace and stability and broader geopolitical trends. And I want to emphasize that migration has not been a side note in understanding the politics and conflicts in the region, and it's also central to understanding emigration from the region is central to understanding dynamics within Europe itself. So a large and growing body of academic research suggests that mass migration and displacement, particularly if it's disorderly, unplanned, and uncoordinated, has the potential to have negative security consequences for receiving communities. And this is especially true if migration alters the demographic, ethnic, sectarian balance within the host state, if refugees are cast as economic competitors with locals, and if there's poor capacity to integrate these communities. And that's why the host countries and the international community as a whole has an especially important role to play in ensuring that these vulnerable populations enjoy safety and security, that they can integrate effectively into workplaces and schools. But many countries in the region, indeed most of the countries in the region, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and others, are not party to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and only grant rights to refugees on an ad hoc basis. So what I thought I would do with the rest of my comments is to focus on the past of displacement crises and how they're essential for understanding geopolitics in the region, talk about the current situations, especially around Syrians, and maybe prognosticate about the future and how migration dynamics might affect the region as a whole. So it's beginning with the past, it's important to understand that migration was linked with security from the very beginning of the modern Middle Eastern state system. So first, let's just be clear that international migration in the core Middle East was not a thing before the 20th century. This was the Ottoman Empire, so moving between, say, modern-day Jordan and Syria was not crossing international boundaries. And it's only with World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, British and French colonial rule, that the borders of this region took shape. And from the very beginning, right after World War I, we saw the first migration crisis, refugee exodus, shaping the region, and that was Jewish refugees fleeing Europe, fleeing fascism, Nazism, and really fleeing generations of persecution and marginalization in Europe, and understandably wanting a state of their own in which they can live in security. But this necessarily brought them into conflict with Arab locals who were already there, and who objected to the demographic change that they were seeing, and to the establishment of a Jewish state on land that their fathers and grandfathers had cultivated and lived on for generations. So we all know this history, but this conflict comes to a head in 1948, and the next major wave of refugees that affect the geopolitics of the region were Palestinians. Palestinians created the Palestine Liberation Organization. This entity became a state within Jordan, later moved to Lebanon, and in both countries sparked a civil conflict, and in the case of Lebanon, Israeli occupation until 2000. So migration dynamics have been central to understanding security within the region for a very long time. And this brings us to today with the Syrian refugee crisis, which is the largest displacement crisis in the region since the Palestinians. Of course, we can talk about Iraq, Yemen, and many other displacement crises in the region, but the Syrian exodus, 7 million people having fled the country, not counting those internally displaced, is the largest refugee exodus in the region since the Palestinians. As was mentioned, Turkey hosts about 3.5 million refugees. About 1 million have gone to Lebanon. Over 600,000 have gone to Jordan. And these are just tremendous numbers of displaced people. So the parallels with Palestinians, many people have drawn that link. Now, the bit of good news is that the worst predictions of many analysts at the beginning of the Syrian crisis have not materialized. Many feared that Syrians in Lebanon in particular would upset the delicate demographic balance between its religious communities, and that Hezbollah's entry into the Syrian civil war on the side of Iran and the Assad government would spark a new Lebanese conflict. Now, we've seen many difficulties in Lebanon. There have been some security incidents, but the country and the other neighboring countries have not, by and large, been plunged into chaos. But this doesn't mean that things have been rosy within the region. Lebanon, as we all know, remains a very fragile state. It's plagued by corruption, and resentment against Syrian refugees has been on the rise. Government policies have made it very hard for Syrians to find permanent employment, jobs, educational opportunities, and violent attacks on Syrians have increased. Turkey was once a model for hosting refugees. It welcomed refugees in the very beginning with open arms, but we've seen a real downturn, a deterioration of public opinion. And just last year, there were violent assaults against Syrians in Ankara. The overall climate for Syrians in Turkey has deteriorated. Jordan has largely forced Syrians into camps, and although it has issued some work permits recently, many Syrians remain in a precarious situation. And this contrasts quite starkly with Palestinians in Jordan who are granted citizenship. The prospect for Syrians obtaining citizenship is basically not on the table. So while we haven't seen large-scale conflict as a result of the Syrian crisis in neighboring countries, these countries are not out of the woods. And it's very clear that for many, if not most Syrians, the prospect of going home is virtually gone. And if governments in the region continue to deny refugees and their children meaningful opportunities for work, employment, housing, and basic political rights, we'll have a ticking bomb of anger and resentment. It's not hard to deduce that if a significant share of people lack basic opportunities to live in dignity and suffer from a sense of hopelessness, some of them will turn toward radical groups. Now, the other geopolitical crisis that the Syrian refugee crisis, and indeed migration from across the region, has engendered is within Europe. It's raised alarm bells within Europe. And although there are sort of many factors that are driving current trends, populist trends in European politics, it was the European so-called asylum crisis of 2015 that precipitated the UK's exit from the European Union and has fueled the rise of right-wing xenophobic parties such as the National Front in France, which almost won the last French election, and the Alternative for Germany. While Ukrainians have been warmly welcomed in recent months, the approach was quite different when we were dealing with non-white African and Arab refugees. So governments within the region, within the Middle East, mostly transit countries for migrants, have recognized this and have used it to their diplomatic advantage. Migration has been weaponized to extract concessions and aid packages from the EU. The EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa has allocated 5 billion euros to persuade North African nations to keep vulnerable migrants in hellish conditions where they have basically no rights. And similar deals have been struck with Turkey to make sure migrants stay there and don't make the journey on to the EU. Governments such as Turkey, Morocco, and Libya have used the threat of opening the door to migrants to gain leverage on European governments. Just last year, Morocco allowed 12,000 migrants to cross into Spain to extract financial concessions and to punish it for allowing the leader of the Polisario Front, the Western Sahara independence movement, entry for medical reasons. And this should be disturbing to all of us. Migrants are being used as diplomatic weapons, and European xenophobia is being turned against it for political gain. So now looking to the future, and I'll be brief on this because it's somewhat more speculative, but the looming crisis facing the entire region, and indeed the entire globe, is climate change and an upcoming ecological disaster. The Fertile Crescent is literally drying out, and we can see this happening. Just last year, Iran saw mass protests over severe water shortages. Currently, Iraq is facing a severe drought, which has crippled agriculture. Shared water resources between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and between Jordan and Israel, are a continued source of tension. And this is not just about soaring populations and declining water resources, but a mismanagement of natural resources. And what does this mean for international migration or regional migration within the region? Well, the truth is we simply do not have an international framework and architecture for dealing with environmental related migration. The typical dichotomy has been people either migrate for economic reasons or they migrate for political reasons. But this climate change, climate disasters, we don't have an international framework for dealing with this problem. When people's livelihoods collapse because of climate change, they're often lumped together with other quote-unquote undeserving economic migrants. So what does this mean for future migration trends? Recent research actually suggests that to the extent that climate change negatively impacts people's financial resources and agricultural livelihoods, this actually may reduce long-distance migration to places such as the EU. People who don't have the resources, don't have enough cash to pay smugglers and to make long journeys, don't migrate long distances. Instead, people and the bulk of people affected by climate change are more likely to move to cities, contributing to already stretched abilities to provide basic public services. So as agricultural livelihoods collapse in the region and urbanization increase, the region will become more dependent on increasingly volatile international food markets. And let's not forget that among the many causes that precipitated the Arab Spring in 2011, one of them was an unprecedented global price spike in the price of food. People were literally marching with baguettes in the Arab Spring, and we're seeing that now, both as a result of the Ukraine war, which has affected international food markets, but other ecological problems around the world. So an environmental crisis, continued government problems, ethno-sectarian tensions, and regional rivalries make for a very unstable mix, and as always, it's the innocent people that suffer the most.
Thank you, Aydin. And now we'll hear from Marissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to listen to all my colleagues across the panels. So I'm going to actually start with a story that I think encapsulates many of the social and economic challenges that the most recent refugee crisis in the Middle East has basically affected the region, and that's the Syrian refugee crisis. So on one of my visits to a local public school in Mafraq in the northeastern part of Jordan as part of this project, I checked in with the school principals from time to time to see if all their needs are being met. Many of these public schools up in the northern part of Jordan are in really bad condition. And they have a hard time keeping kids in school, Jordanian kids in school. So the principal was in the middle of shifting the Jordanian girl students, female students, out for the afternoon shift where the Syrian students came in. So I got to witness that. And I noticed that there was a heated conversation between one of the moms and the principal. And later the principal explained that she was basically telling her that this is going to be her last week in school. This was technically in elementary and middle school, and that young girl was being pulled out because they found her a suitor. And that is the harsh reality of what it was like to be a Syrian refugee living in Mafraq. And the same principal sat down and started complaining about how often she is encountering this phenomenon, and then told me a story about a Jordanian woman who kept nagging her husband to take her to the Zatari refugee camp, which is about 10 kilometers from Mafraq, in order to buy this famous magdous. This is a very famous Syrian eggplant-based dish, and everybody was talking about this Syrian magdous. So they get to the camp, the lady, gets out to buy the magdous, and her husband waits in the car, and this man approaches the car with a young lady covered up in a niqab, so completely covered up, and he looked like a sheikh. He had a sort of, white grayish beard. And then within 10-15 minutes, the girl hopped in the car. And when the wife arrived, the husband said, "Oh, we're just going to drop her off on the way." But when they got back home, he basically said, "Meet my new wife." And that is how quick these deals, and unfortunately I'm going to refer to these as deals, these deals take place within, the Zatari refugee camp has its own economy, and it's been quite an active economy because it's confined within the borders of the camp itself. But unfortunately, young girls and young women were one of the commodities to be exchanged. And that, I think, encapsulates so many of the challenges that both the Syrian refugees are facing, but also the local host communities are facing. And the one thing that came out of that lady's mouth after she found out that her husband has a new wife to add was basically, how can we afford this? It was not anger that she's going to share her husband and who's going to start a new family. It was triggered by this fear of financial and economic challenges. And once again, that I think encapsulates the challenges that the host communities are facing. And having said that, when we look at the data, and that also applies, early child marriage applies also to Syrian communities in Lebanon, and both Lebanon and in Jordan, I don't have figures on Turkey, since 2013, 2014 until 2016, 2017, the numbers have risen over 30%, and then with the pandemic, which of course hit the Syrian refugee communities hardest, because most of them are in the informal economy, despite the fact that Syrians have been granted work authorization in places like Jordan and Turkey, the vast majority prefer to operate in the informal economy. And so these economic conditions have affected more than just local host communities and refugees, but we're looking at generations that have little or no access to education, and for those who do have access to education and do go through that path, there is very little hope and very little prospects for finding jobs or starting their own businesses, because the communities and the societies or the countries that they're being hosted in are experiencing their own economic hardships. So in a country like Jordan, the latest figure that the World Bank alarmingly reported on a few months ago was 50% youth unemployment. And so when the discussion takes place amongst the government and UNHCR, as well as other NGOs and international organizations that work on the refugee issue, with regards to work authorization and providing job opportunities for Syrians, the very issue that my colleague talked about, these social and political tensions arise. Well, we have our own unemployment issues to deal with. The Syrians are going to steal our jobs. And in many cases, the Syrians that had arrived had skills that the Jordanian labor force or the Lebanese labor force did not have. And so that, again, sort of puts together the various economic and socioeconomic, as well as the social challenges that the refugee crisis, particularly the Syrian refugee crisis, has resulted with. And that is why we need to look at addressing this crisis, which is now more of a protracted issue than just an immediate crisis to respond to, as beyond humanitarian response. The humanitarian response is essential. There are families that have dropped further down the poverty line as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And organizations like the World Food Program and UNHCR and others that give cash assistance or coupons for food items and other necessities is absolutely important. But what is also more important, keeping in mind that there's a whole generation of Syrian children that have been born and raised either in refugee camps or in local host communities without any knowledge of what Syria looks like, because they were born and raised as refugees, is basically the importance of investing in education, in providing health services, and creating jobs. These are sort of the ingredients for a formula to save a potentially lost generation. Again, you mentioned that, in places like Jordan, many of the refugees were forced into camps, and that is absolutely correct. The government has tried to do that, but 80% of the refugees remain in urban centers. And so it becomes more of a challenge for these host communities where the public services were poor to begin with, particularly schools and health clinics or hospitals, and of course the added responsibility or burden of also having to provide for refugees has completely crumbled that system. So I would add investing in governance. Many of the problems that we're seeing that have been, I guess, unraveled by the refugee crisis, but also later on more severely by the pandemic, at the core of it is poor governance structures across the public sector that have been ignored for many years. And so any response moving forward, and this is something that the United States government is aware of, and US aid as well, has to redirect funding and focus on more long-term development assistance and development support, precisely because this is not a crisis that is going to end anytime soon. We've seen with the case of the Palestinian refugees how UNRWA, with all its challenges, has created an ecosystem where there are schools, vocational training centers, as well as other sort of community centers that brought the community together. It's not perfect. They've had their own political challenges, and in many ways has the agency itself has been politicized in many directions. But the core, at the core of it, they provided important services and created opportunities for Palestinian children that have been born and raised in refugee camps, particularly in Jordan, but within Palestine as well. Now, Kathleen, you talked a little bit about the impact of the Ukraine crisis, and I just want to zoom in a little bit because I think this is very much tied to the donor assistance and the focus on the developmental issues. Beyond just, I guess, diverting resources to Ukraine, I think the perception as well is that refugees in the Middle East are not receiving or have not received the same treatment that refugees in Ukraine have. Social media exploded when one of the NBC reporters in Ukraine referred to Kiev as a, and the rest of Ukraine is a semi-civilized society, unlike others from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And that exploded all over Arab media, and the sense of despair even more so amongst refugee populations who are also at the receiving end of the impact of this redirection of focus as well as resources. With regards to the food insecurity crisis, it will most severely affect Lebanon and Yemen because both of them are particularly dependent on wheat from Ukraine, and we're already seeing inflation rise, socio-political tensions and socio-economic tensions rise across the region because of difficult economic conditions, and this will only make things more difficult for refugee communities, precisely because the vast majority of them live in urban centers and not in refugee camps. And so the one recommendation that I would, I guess, leave with today is continuing this conversation is essential to resuscitate the the challenge of the refugee issue in the Middle East. It is nowhere near the headlines anymore because it's been completely overtaken. And with that attention diminishing, resources also diminish. The response plan that UNHCR put together for 2020 was only 20% funded. And the expectation is that other response plans for this year and next year will also be underfunded. And that's just basic humanitarian needs. So there is an urgency to address many of these issues in a way that both refugees but also host communities are benefiting, because in the future, both on the economic but also on the socio-political fronts, it will create more challenges and instability. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Okay, and last we'll hear from Beth.
Thank you very much. And kudos to the Baker Institute for putting displacement on the agenda. Displacement is a security issue, is a strategic issue, it's a development issue. It's too important to just leave to humanitarians. Certainly if we're going to resolve displacement, find solutions, but also if we're to see that displacement doesn't destabilize economies, create resentment, tensions, and create more conflicts, we need to take this very seriously. Since I am speaker number 23 today, I'm going to be very brief and talk particularly about internal displacement. 2/3 of the world's displaced are internally displaced. That means they've been forced from their homes, often for the same reasons as refugees have fled their countries, by conflict, violence, persecution, but they haven't made it to a border. Sometimes they've made it to a border, as in making it to the Syrian-Turkish border, and haven't been able to cross. Borders everywhere are closing. It's likely that we're going to see more people who would leave leave their country if they could, but they can't, so they remain internally displaced. Unlike refugees, there is no convention on IDPs, internally displaced persons. Even in countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Bangladesh and others that haven't signed the convention, at least there's binding international law that sets out what you should do, what the obligations of countries and other actors are. There's nothing like that for IDPs. There's a little bit of soft laws, some general guiding principles, but no law. There's no single UN agency. Refugees have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. UNRWA serves Palestinian refugees. For IDPs, it's all up for negotiation. Who's best placed? Who has resources? Is this in the media? Are the funders interested in it? Then maybe we can help out. Most importantly, the responsibility for protecting and assisting IDPs lies with the national government. That means the Yemeni government is responsible for protecting and assisting over 4 million IDPs in Yemen. It means the Syrian government is responsible for protecting and assisting 7 million IDPs inside Syria. Sometimes you see in the media these depictions of refugees as victims of really the worst off people from a conflict, and yet sometimes refugees are the lucky ones. I mean, think about Ukraine, the faces we've seen on the Polish and Moldovan border, and then think of those who've moved within their country. And please give a thought to those who can't move, those who are trapped for reasons of physical mobility, or because they're caring for a grandmother, or because they don't have the resources even to move. We know there's a relationship between internal displacement and cross-border movements. Surveys in lots of different countries, unfortunately not in Syria. There's not great survey research among IDPs in Syria. But we know that in many countries, people will move 3, 4, 5, 6, 25 times within the country before they cross the border, seeking protection elsewhere. One characteristic of internal displacement in the Middle East is that it is protracted. Most IDPs in the region have been displaced for more than 5 years, some for more than 10 years. It's a dynamic process. People don't just move once, they will move multiple times. They'll go stay with an aunt and things get hot there and they move on, and stay with a friend here and they move to a shelter there. And so it's hard to keep track of the dynamic nature of that movement. That's also true of refugees, by the way. We don't hear much about refugees going back and forth across borders. The Iraqi refugees were really well known for this, going back to Iraq to collect a pension or check on property or on a relative. And the Turkish government has said 500,000 Syrian refugees have returned voluntarily to Syria. The UN puts the figure at 50,000 and says, really questions how voluntary some of those returns have been. In the case of Syria right now, there's particular concern about the 2 million or so who are displaced in the northeastern part of the country near the Turkish border. And maybe you read that just last week the Turkish government said yet again that it intends to set up a buffer zone in northeastern Syria of about 30 kilometers, and that it was hoping that 1 million Syrian refugees could be returned to that buffer zone, that safe area. And as Ideen said, this seems to have been in response to concerns about Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO, of saying that this is a way of really diminishing Kurdish presence in that area, and also putting pressure on European governments not to react for what could turn out to be quite problematic. Also, you have the situation in northern Syria of these detention camps with former ISIS fighters who've been imprisoned, including large numbers of Iraqis, other nationalities. This is a ticking time bomb. And this is an issue that's very politicized. The camps are awful, Al Hol camp in particular. These camps are made up of 60% women and children, many of whom are married to or have a relationship with individuals who fought against or with ISIS. So it's a very delicate political situation. It's a security threat for northeastern Syria and indeed for the region as a whole. Kelsey asked me just to say a word about Afghanistan, although it really hasn't come up much today. But you know, do you remember last August and September when we all stared at the television and social media watching the evacuation of desperate Afghans at the airport? I remember having an Afghan fella come talk to my class, and about a month later, and he said, "Oh, I hope there's no invasion of Ukraine, because if there's an invasion of Ukraine, Afghan is off the agenda." And indeed, we've seen much less media attention. But the situation inside Afghanistan, particularly for the 4 million plus internally displaced people, is terribly. I mean, it's grim. It's catastrophic. The destruction of the infrastructure, the public health system isn't working. There isn't enough food. You've got, it's really a very dire situation, and very little attention now to Afghanistan. There are still Afghans being evacuated to the United States, but the scale of humanitarian need inside Afghanistan is very, very high. Since this has been a depressing panel, actually it's been a depressing day, I want to close with a few remarks about what's happening in northern Iraq. Now you'll recall that when the big conflicts with ISIS occurred, some 4 or 5 million people were displaced in northern Iraq. Most of them have returned to their home communities. There's still about 2 million IDPs, and unfortunately there are new displacements that are also occurring. But the Iraqi government in northern Iraq decided to close the IDP camps in August 2019. Since then, most of the IDPs have made their way home or near home, or at least in the same region as their home, with it's gone remarkably well. The biggest problems with that are housing. People aren't returning because their homes were destroyed. There isn't a compensation scheme set up to provide assistance to returning Iraqi IDPs to rebuild their homes, but that's been very slow to get started. So even though you see that some of these situations have gone on for a long time, desperate humanitarian need, and at the same time there are possibilities for finding solutions when there is political will. We don't see that, of course, in Syria and other countries right now, but hopefully there will be some progress. And then just to say a word about climate change. Climate displacement has become the hot new issue in the humanitarian field. There are dozens of conferences and reports and so on that are written about what's going to happen to people who show up on a country's borders because of a disaster or environmental hazards. The reality is most people are not going to cross an international border. Most people displaced by the effects of climate change, disasters, environmental hazards of all kinds, some of which aren't caused by climate change, are going to be displaced internally. We think what's going to happen is that people with resources will see the handwriting on the wall. Things are getting bad, and they will use traditional migration routes. Won't show up in anybody's statistics as moving to, another city to avoid the problem. But those who are displaced by sudden onset or slow onset disasters are going to be the ones who are going to need assistance, and where governments, and here I would especially point to local governments, municipal, state governments, are probably going to be in the front lines of this migration. I sometimes use the example of, I have two sisters who live in South Texas. After the hurricanes of the last couple of years, they were both evacuated 3 times. They both had flood damage. They're about the same age, about the same socioeconomic condition. And one of my sisters who lives in Beaumont said, I've had it. I'm out of here. I'm moving to San Antonio. And she did. And my other sister said, well, I can't move. My job's here. My husband's job's here. So she's still in Galveston. And she says, well, I'm just kind of getting prepared that, every few months we'll just pack up and go see my sister now in San Antonio. But individuals have different levels of risk tolerance too, and so that kind of movement is going to take place. And who knows, maybe one of my sisters can officially call herself a climate migrant or an internally displaced climate person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. There's so many questions I want to ask. Unfortunately, we're a little short on time. So I'm just going to try one question that kind of ties a few different things together, and everyone's welcome to respond. So, Marissa, you really emphasized the importance of a shift from humanitarian aid to longer-term support, especially development support and support for host communities. But I want to think about that in juxtaposition with some of the issues that Aideen and others brought up about it's a slippery slope between that kind of aid and governments, and we've seen this especially from countries in the Middle East over the past 6 or 7 years, using that kind of leverage to pressure Europe for more aid, to engage in this type of sort of rent-seeking behavior regarding refugee hosting. So how do we find this middle ground between offering aid that supports host country governments, host country communities, as well as refugees, and also preventing that type of bargaining chip behavior, using refugees as a bargaining chip? So anyone's welcome to respond.
I'll take a stab at that. I think the middle ground is ensuring that the aid is being sort of monitored and tied to progress on the ground. There will always be excuses for missing the target when it comes to work authorization documents, for example. But I think there are ways around it, and it has to be a frank and open and candid conversation. And this is the right time to do it, precisely because many of these countries are in dire need for support. It has to be tied to a timeline, to projects, and I think and monitored. That progress has to be, monitored on the ground. Of course, the region is also subject to so many different disruptions, both from within the region, but also, as we've seen with the global pandemic, things that you cannot predict. So there will always be these interruptions, and that's just the nature of how things work in the region. But I think something along the lines of monitored progress that is tied to this donor aid is one way around it. Because if you cut out that aid, a lot of these countries will sink further and further. And many of these communities will also be severely affected, both refugees but also host communities. And so I see that as one possible way of doing it.
Yeah, I concur on most of what you just said, Marissa, but I think we also need to get away from the sort of donor assistance mentality, and which encourages that kind of rent-seeking behavior or transactional sort of behavior. And I think it's very consistent with what you said about moving to development aid, that I think donors need to focus very heavily on investing in and deploying the skills and energies of refugees themselves, because that not only benefits refugees, but the host communities. And, when the Syrians first started going to Turkey in great numbers, it was it was a real boost to the Turkish economy, and not just because of the humanitarian aid that came in, not even mostly because of that, but because the Syrians brought tremendous skills in the textile industry, in a number of industries, particularly artisanal industries, and were also provided labor for Turkish agriculture, which was languishing because not many Turks wanted to work in agriculture. Refugees, the least skilled among them, are always going to be sort of at the bottom of the ladder in the labor market, but they can get a foot on that ladder in many cases. And if there is investment in their skills and just their raw energies, I think it's possible for support to using those assets can encourage the host countries to welcome them. This will be even more true for Ukrainians who are entering countries that are facing aging and declining populations and have really serious labor needs. It's more difficult in countries where you have saturated labor markets, but the secret is to expand labor markets, expand industries, and make sure that the refugee populations and the native populations are working together and benefit equally, or perhaps not equally, perhaps with a bit of a bias toward the native populations for those benefits.
May I add just one thing with that? And I agree with you, Kathleen, on the shifting a lot of these to project-based and skilling, education, etc. But also tapping into the local organizations that are already working on the ground. So, yes. And that empowers civil society groups and other groups, for that matter, to be part of the solution. So, yes, we need to shift away from donor aid, but that is important in the interim, and that could be part of a long-term solution. As you phase out, you empower local organizations to be able to take more of that responsibility.
Of course, that's not going to compensate for disastrous economic management, as in Turkey, where and very often when you have a declining economy, whether through mismanagement or external affairs, it's all too easy to blame refugees for the declines.
If I could just add here to pick up something that came up in an earlier panel, is just the importance of leadership. I mean, when the head of a government gives a positive sign about refugees, it makes a difference. And I think we see in Turkey that originally welcoming, perhaps for political reasons as well, really expecting that the Assad regime wouldn't last very long, and that didn't work out. And so, became almost scapegoating of refugees as an excuse for poor economic behavior. Turkey is really a sad case. I don't know if any of you follow the Syria Barometer, which are public opinion surveys in Turkey, but, over the last 5 years, you've seen Syrians feel much more at home. Every year they report more Syrian friends, less crime, their kids are accepted, they're learning the language, they feel comfortable, they feel safe. And from the Turkish perspective, it's just the opposite. Every year there's more hostility, there's more crime, there's more fear. They don't fit in, we don't want them as friends. I mean, this is exactly the opposite of what you would hope would happen, with Syrians feeling more comfortable and being more accepted by Turks. So I think that role of public opinion and leadership is really crucial as well, as we've seen in this country when it comes to accepting refugees.
I think I should actually, sorry, Adine, do you want to also comment? Yeah? Okay, yeah, I think it's time to gather a few questions if there are some from the audience. I see one hand back there.
Excellent panel. When we look at the migration crisis / refugee issues in Europe, this kind of gave way or propelled what's defined as the populist movement in Europe, like we saw as an example with lately with the French elections with Marine Le Pen and even Eric Zemmour. Now, but however, they didn't make it all the way. when we look at the same situation here, it seems, no, the populist movements, or what's defined as, will gain ground. What's the main difference between the two?
Well, one, it's a difference of electoral system. So we have a two-party system with the president, so that explains part of it. But I still wouldn't discount the role of the populist movements within Europe in maybe not always taking control of government, but having real changes on the policy output and the tenor of the debate. So if we think about how Angela Merkel, in the beginning of the Syrian asylum crisis, handled the situation, she was actually quite welcoming, alone among many European leaders, and welcoming Syrian refugees. But when the AfD then became the third largest party, and the rise of this sort of far-right xenophobic movement threatened her coalition, she quickly changed tune and changed policies toward asylum seekers. So even if they haven't been able to capture national governments in all cases, France, Germany, and so on, they've changed the national discussion quite a bit. Although the Brexit party, or the UKIP party, only won one seat in the British parliamentary elections, they were able to successfully push for Brexit. Migration was not the only issue in the Brexit campaign, but it was probably the biggest issue that they campaigned on. So although the parties didn't come to power, they did have dramatic implications for European cohesion and for the rise of these extremist groups.
I'm a little more optimistic about that, I must say. I mean, AfD collapsed in the last German elections, and the far right in France only gained ground by de-emphasizing migration. Marine Le Pen hardly spoke about migration in the election, and really emphasized sort of pocketbook, kitchen table issues, and really tried to distance herself from the even farther right opponent. And in Brexit, I think, and I lived through that, that the immigration issue was much more about Eastern European immigrants who were members of EU member states who could travel freely and did travel freely to Britain and work in Britain, and very successfully. And the British working class was much more exercised about the Polish plumbers than about refugees, partly because Britain didn't let in many refugees. So I think there's some nuance there, and that the really harsh anti-immigration rhetoric has not pulled the right to success, or certainly not to power, but even to sort of declining results in much of Western Europe. It's a different story in Eastern Europe. But I was very struck with, and I lived part of the time in Paris, I was very struck with Le Pen's retreat from the migration issue and from xenophobic rhetoric in this last election.
Do you think that's because it's a losing issue, or just it lost its pressingness over time in the minds of the voters?
I think it's a losing issue.
One more, yes. Oh, sorry, the ambassador has a question.
That there's no international convention on the looming climate change migration. Are you aware of any thoughts, plans, strategies being put in place in order that you could recommend to the administration or administrations on, creating an international framework for climate change migration?
Yeah, one of the first things President Biden did when he came in was issue an order asking for the State Department to come up with a report on how to deal with climate migration. So they produced their report. Right now there are at least 10, 12, maybe 20 draft international conventions on climate migration. Most of them are written by academics and lawyers who think this is a great idea. The real problem is defining who is a climate migrant. Is everyone who leaves Honduras after a hurricane a climate migrant? What about someone who flees an earthquake or a volcano? That's not climate related. We know that climate change always interacts with other factors. So your economic situation, for example, your age, the intellectually honest term would be to say someone who moves at least in part because of the effects of environmental hazards. That does not roll off the tongue in terms of climate refugee. At least people kind of understand that, but they're not refugees under the convention. So I think they're really struggling with these issues of what's the appropriate policy response and what do we do. And if I could just add one more thing that hasn't come up on our panel, and that is that our system for dealing with refugees is broken. I mean, it's a systemic problem. We can talk about donors and particular governments, but the original idea was the country hosting, it would be a shared responsibility, not just a country that happens to border a country with a crisis producing refugees. We should all be responding. And instead what we see is this system of responsibility sharing never worked terribly well, but it certainly isn't working now in terms of sharing the responsibility. So maybe we need some new system, but there aren't a lot of creative minds or political will to come up with a better system for dealing with people who are forced from their countries for reasons beyond their control.
May I add something to that? Because that's one point I wanted to raise. When you bring up this issue about the dwindling donor aid coming in from the West, many people raise a red flag around, well, what about all the Arab countries in the region, beyond just the bordering host countries? What is their role? I mean, many of them give money to UNHCR and directly to some of these governments, or they sponsor a small camp. But beyond that, they have not taken any refugees. And those that they have taken are highly skilled and come from a particular socio-economic level. So that's a conversation that has to be had, and if it's a shared responsibility, it cannot only be shared with the West, it has to be shared with the rest of the region, where the rest of the region has the means to do it.
It's interesting because none of the Gulf states, for example, are signatories of the Refugee Convention, and they don't have a legal category of refugee. And yet a great many Syrians have gone, for example, to Saudi Arabia. Tens of thousands are living in Saudi Arabia and working. They're not called refugees, and they don't have the protections of refugees, but it's I think many refugees would rather be migrant workers, skilled migrant workers, than refugees, which carries its own sort of stigma. I think it is a very interesting question of how to involve, beyond just as donors, how to involve other countries in the regions. And there again, I think, trying to make as many refugees as possible into assets rather than drains on an economy. The last time I went to Syria, about 2 or 3 months before the war broke out, I was looking at the plight of Iraqi refugees in Syria, and there was an UNRWA training center for Iraqi refugees, which was turning out medical technicians, IT engineers, not high level, but programmers, coders, and so on. And they were in great demand in the Syrian economy, to the point where I was getting a little bit worried that there would be resentment among Syrians because so many of these Iraqi refugees and Palestinian refugees, of course, were getting jobs, skilled jobs in Syria. But if that could be the model, or at least part of the model, to turn out refugees who are equipped to fill jobs in demand, I think that would go a long way. And this is one of the secrets of the success of Canada, probably the most successful country in terms of refugee policy. Not only do they accept a large number of refugees and have great citizen involvement, but their immigration policy is very much attuned to the needs of the Canadian economy, so that newcomers are not seen as burdens, and refugees sort of come under that umbrella as well. And there's almost no political controversy about the refugee program or about the fact that Canada accepts 1%, the equivalent of 1% of its population as immigrants and refugees every year. It's seen as an asset.
Well, we can end there on that somewhat optimistic note. I'm also half Canadian, so I like that. Thank you so much to our panelists.